History has a wicked sense of irony. There are dynasties born to rule, and then there are dynasties that really should have just stayed on their estates drinking wine. The House of Valois was definitely the latter, yet fate thrust them onto the throne at the absolute worst possible moment. Imagine winning the lottery, but the prize includes a 116-year war with your rude English neighbors. The Black Death wiping out half the population, and a genetic defect that makes your king believe he is made of glass. Welcome to 14th century. France, the Valois did not ascend to power and glory. They took the crown thanks to a legal loophole called Salic law. A fantastic excuse for Frenchmen to say, no, we would rather pick a distant cousin than let a woman or her son, the King of England, rule over us. From 1328 to 1589, this dynasty transformed France from a medieval ruin into a dazzling Renaissance superpower. But the price was paid in blood, betrayal, and family dramas that even HBO writers wouldn't dare script. This is the story of naive knights dying under a rain of arrows, of a peasant girl who saved the kingdom only to be burned at the stake, of a spider king weaving webs of power in the shadows, and of a collapse into a religious bloodbath. Fasten your seatbelts. We are entering the era of the House of Valois. In the year 1328, the Capetian dynasty, a miraculous genetic machine that had produced an unbroken line of male heirs for over 3 centuries, finally ran out of luck. King Charles IV died, leaving behind a pregnant wife, a mountain of debt, and a terrifying silence where a son's cry should have been. For the first time in French history, the throne was empty. The crown was gathering dust, and the vultures began to circle. Now, by all laws of blood and logic, the crown should have passed to the closest living male relative. That man was Edward III. There was just one tiny inconvenient problem with Edward. He was the King of England, the French nobility staring down the barrel of being ruled by a man who preferred boiled beef to hot cuisine, panicked. They frantically dusted off an ancient, obscure legal code from the time of the barbarian Franks, called the Salic law. This law stated quite conveniently that women could not inherit land, and therefore could not pass the right of inheritance to their sons. It was essentially a no girls allowed sign hung on the treehouse of French power. By using this legal loophole, they bypassed Edward and handed the crown to a cousin, a man named Philip of Valois. Philip thought he had won the lottery. In reality, he had just signed the death warrant for the old world. The House of Valois was not born in glory. It was born in a courtroom drama that would spiral into the longest war in human history. Welcome to the story of the House of Valois. The Capetians were the builders of France. The Valois were its tragic poets, its madmen, and its butchers. Over the next 261 years, this dysfunctional family would take France on a roller coaster ride through hell. They would preside over the H-100 Red Years' War, lose half their population to the Black Death, and watch their own king shatter into madness, believing he was made of glass. But this is not just a story of misery. It is under the Valois that the medieval world died, screaming in the mud of Agincourt to be reborn in the marble halls of the Renaissance. They gave us Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who saved a kingdom only to be burned by the very men she crowned. They gave us the Spider King Louis XI, a man so devious he makes Machiavelli look like a kindergarten teacher. Gave us Catherine de' Medici and a religious bloodbath so severe it nearly drowned the nation. To understand the Valois is to understand the very nature of power itself. It is not a shiny golden object held by the righteous. It is a slippery, bloody dagger that cuts the hand of anyone foolish enough to pick it up. Imagine the world they stepped into. The 14th century was not a time you would want to visit, even with a time machine and a full hazmat suit. The climate was cooling, triggering the Little Ice Age. Crops were failing. Famine was the default setting of existence. The feudal system, that rigid pyramid of loyalty that had held society together for centuries, was beginning to crack under the weight of greed and inflation. In this world, a knight in shining armor was no longer a tank. He was a target. The code of chivalry was dying, slowly being strangled by the cold pragmatism of mercenaries and gunpowder. The church, once the unshakable pillar of moral authority, was busy tearing itself apart with rival popes fighting for the keys to heaven. It was onto this rotting, unstable stage that the House of Valois walked. They were accidental kings ruling over a graveyard. They were arrogant. They were unprepared. And they were doomed to learn the hardest lesson of all. That legitimacy is not written in law books, but in blood. And trust me, there will be blood. If Philip V, 6 had a LinkedIn profile, his job title would have been the Fortunate. He was the first Valois king, a man who stumbled onto the throne because his cousins forgot to have sons. But luck, as Philip would soon discover, is a finite resource. Philip spent his entire allotment on day one. Philip was the embodiment of old-school French nobility. He loved tournaments, he loved velvet, and he loved the sound of his own voice. To him, war was a gentleman's game, a series of polite skirmishes where you captured a fellow aristocrat, drank wine with him, and ransomed him back for a nice profit. He looked across the English Channel at Edward III and saw not a rival, but a nuisance. He called Edward the wool merchant. It was meant to be an insult. After all, England's economy relied heavily on selling wool to Flanders, while France was the center of culture in Christendom. But mocking a man's bank account is rarely a good survival strategy, especially when that man has a claim to your house. In 1337, the pleasantries ended. Philip, in a fit of overconfidence, confiscated the Duché of Aquitaine, English land on French soil. Edward III didn't just get mad, he got creative. He declared that if Philip wanted to take his land, he would. Take Philip's crown. Edward proclaimed himself the rightful king of France. The 100 Red Years' War had begun. Not with a bang, but with a lawyer's letter and a wool embargo. The first major collision happened not on land, but at sea. The Battle of Sluys in 1340. And this is where we see the first glimpse of the Valois family genius for military incompetence. The French admirals, presumably after drinking a significant amount of wine, decided that the best way to defend against the English fleet was to chain their ships together. Yes, you heard that right. They tied their massive fleet together, hull to hull, creating a giant, immobile wooden island in the middle of the Este. They essentially built a floating parking lot for the English army. Edward III must have looked through his spyglass and thought it was his birthday. The English ships, nimble and free, danced around the paralyzed French bloc. Then came the arrows. This was the debut of the English longbow, a weapon that would haunt the French for a century. The English archers rained death upon the trapped French sailors. It was a massacre. The French panicked and jumped into the water where they're heavy. Armor acted as very efficient anchors. Nearly 20,000 French sailors died that day. The destruction was so complete that the king's court jester was the only one brave enough to break the news to Philip. He told the king, "The English are such cowards, sire. They don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French sailors." It is said that for years afterwards, if the fish in the channel could speak, they would have spoken French because they had feasted on so much French meat. But just as the war was heating up, something else arrived. Something that didn't care about flags, lineage, or wool. In 1347, a Genoese trading ship docked in Marseille, carried spices, silks, and a few rats with very active fleas. Passengers were mostly dead or dying, oozing black pus from golf ball-sized boils in their armpits and groins. The Black Death had arrived. The war was a tragedy. The plague was the apocalypse. It moved north like an invisible oil slick. It didn't negotiate. It didn't take ransoms. It killed the priest during the last rites. It killed the doctor examining the patient. It killed the mother nursing the child. In Paris, the streets were piled so high with bodies that wolves came down from the countryside to feed in broad daylight. Philip VI, the man who loved pageantry, watched his kingdom turn into a morgue. The economy collapsed because there were no peasants left to harvest the wheat. The tax base evaporated. The war ground to a halt because even kings can't raise an army when everyone is busy dying. It was nature's way of telling the Valois, "You think you have problems with the English? Hold my beer." By the time the plague subsided, nearly half of France was dead. Philip's wife, Joan the Lame, was among the victims. The fortunate king died in 1350, leaving behind a broken country. an empty treasury, and a son, John II, who was about to prove that incompetence is indeed hereditary. The stage was set for the age of chivalry to die, not by disease, but by the pointy end of an English arrow. If the Battle of Sluys was a tragedy, the Battle of Creil in 1346 was a grim comedy of errors, directed by the French aristocracy. It was the moment the medieval world collided violently with the future, and the result was messy. King Philip VI, eager to avenge his naval humiliation, chased Edward III across northern France. He finally caught him near a small village called Sai. The French army was massive, a glittering sea of banners, horses, and arrogance. They outnumbered the English at least 2-1, in the mind of a Valois king. This was already a victory. All they had to do was charge like they had done for centuries, and the English rabble would scatter. But Edward III had chosen his ground. Carefully, he placed his army on a ridge flanked by forests, and he brought his secret weapon, the longbow bowmen. These weren't noble knights. They were peasants. They didn't care about honor or capturing prisoners for ransom. They were paid to kill. The battle began with a rainstorm, which is fitting, because the French rain was about to be washed away. The French had hired Genoese crossbowmen, the best mercenaries money could buy. But the rain soaked the strings of their crossbows, making them useless. The English longbow bowmen, being practical, men of the earth, had simply taken off their borings and hidden them under their waterproof helmets. When the sun came out, the Genoese walked forward to shoot, but their bolts fell short. The English responded. It wasn't just a volley, it was a blizzard. The Genoese, realizing they were bringing a knife to a gunfight, turned to retreat. And here is where the madness of the French nobility shines brightest. Seeing the mercenaries retreat, the French knights didn't think, "Oh, we should regroup." No, King Philip in a rage shouted, "Kill these rascals, for they block our path." The French knights lowered their lances and charged right into the backs of their own allies. They trampled the Genoese to get to the English. It was a traffic jam of death, horse-tramping man, sword-striking friend. Then the English arrows found the knights. A longbow arrow, bodkin-tipped, doesn't respect a family crest. It punches through plate armor as if it were cardboard. The French chivalry, the flower of Europe, fell in heaps of twisted metal and screaming horseflesh. There is a story from that day that perfectly encapsulates the suicidal stupidity of chivalry. King John of Bohemia, a blind ally of the French, asked his knights to lead him into battle so he could strike one blow. His knights, loyal to the end, tied their horses' bridles to his and rode into the melee. They were all found the next day, dead, their horses still tied together. It was brave, it was poetic, and it was utterly useless. That was the epitaph of the French knight at Sai. 10 years later, in 1356, you would think the Valois had learned their lesson. Enter King John II, known as John the Good. Why the Good? It's probably because he was a nice guy to invite to a dinner party, but as a king, he was a disaster. John faced Edward's son, the Black Prince, at the Battle of Poitiers. The Black Prince was cornered, his army tired and hungry. He even offered to return all the loot he had stolen just to be let go. Smart king would have taken the deal or simply starved the English out. But John the Good wanted a fight, wanted to restore French honor. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot, thinking the horses were the problem at Creil. They weren't. The problem was walking slowly toward a wall of arrows. Result was a carbon copy of Creil, but with a worse ending. The French army was annihilated. King John himself, fighting bravely with his axe, was surrounded. His 14-year-old son Philela stood beside him, shouting warnings, "Father to the right, father to the left." It was a touching father-son bonding moment, except for the part where the King of France was tackled and captured. Now we've reached the height of irony. While France descended into anarchy, with peasants revolting and mercenaries burning villages because there was no king to stop them,
John
the Good was living his best life in London. He was held prisoner at the Savoy Palace, but prisoner is a strong word. He had his own court, his own astrologer, and a pet dog. He bought expensive horses and clothes, sending the bills back to a starving Paris. The English demanded a ransom of 3 million gold crowns. To put that in perspective, it was enough money to buy the entire country of France twice over. The French economy was destroyed to pay for Jay's honor, and then the punchline. John was eventually released on parole to raise the rest of the money, leaving his other son as a hostage in his place. When that son escaped, John the Good, citing his honor as a knight, voluntarily returned to captivity in England. He died there in 1364. A man who valued his own reputation more than the lives of the millions of subjects he left behind to bleed. He was the ultimate good man and the worst possible king. After the catastrophic stupidity of John the Good, France didn't need a hero, it needed an accountant. Entered Charles V, a man who looked less like a king and more like a librarian who hadn't seen the sun in a decade. If his father John was a lion, loud, brave, and intellectually challenged, Charles was a fox with a chronic illness. He was physically frail. His right hand was permanently swollen from an abscess, and he likely suffered from gout. He couldn't swing a sword, he couldn't joust, and he certainly couldn't lead a cavalry charge into a mud pit. For a medieval dynasty obsessed with toxic masculinity, Charles was a disappointment. But for France, he was a miracle. Charles V realized a simple truth that had escaped his ancestors. The English are very good at killing French knights in open fields, so perhaps we should stop meeting them in open fields. It was a revolutionary concept. Became the first Valois king to understand that war isn't about glory, it's about math. Instead of riding into battle himself, Charles sat in his study in the Louvre, which he was busy turning into a magnificent library, and hired someone else to do the dirty work. That someone was Bertrand Duguesclin. If Charles was the brain, Destal was the fist. And what a fist it was. Duguesclin was a minor Breton nobleman, famously described as the ugliest man in France. He was short, squat, and had a face that looked like it had been used to tenderize meat. But he possessed a quality the high-born French dukes lacked. He knew how to win. Together, the Nerd King and the ugly mercenary invented a new kind of warfare. They refused to give the English the satisfaction of a pitched battle. When the English armies, led by the aging Edward III, or his son, marched through France looking for a fight, they found nothing. No knights to slaughter, no glory to be had, just empty villages, burned fields, and locked castles. It was the Fabian strategy, a game of cat and mouse played on a continental scale. The English marched until they were starving. They're expensive. Horses died of hunger, and dysentery did the rest. Then, and only then, would Destal strike, attacking isolated supply lines, ambushing stragglers, and vanishing back into the woods. It was guerrilla warfare in the 14th century. While the English were busy fighting shadows, Charles fought with paper, used lawyers to pick apart the Treaty of Bretigny, finding legal loopholes to reclaim towns one by one, used bribes to turn pro-English cities back to the French crown. He weaponized patriotism, painting the English not just as rivals, but as foreign invaders who didn't belong on sacred French soil. Slowly, methodically, the map of France changed color. The massive red stain of English occupation began to shrink. By the time Charles died in 1380, he had recovered almost all the land his father had lost. He did it without fighting a single glorious battle. He proved that a sharp mind is far more dangerous than a sharp sword, and that sometimes the best way to win a war is to stay home and read a book. But history has a cruel sense of humor. Charles the Wise, the man who saved the Valois dynasty from extinction, made one fatal error. He died too young at the age of 42, and he left his recovered, stabilized kingdom to his son, a boy of 11 named Charles V VI, a boy who would soon inherit the crown, but not the brain. The intermission was over. The madness was about to return. Charles V was the brain of the dynasty. His son Charles V VI was the nervous breakdown. He began his reign with the title Charles the Well-Beloved. He ended it as Charles the Mad. It is a transition that serves as a horrifying metaphor for the entire country. The darkness descended on a hot August day in 1392. The king was riding through a forest near Law, hunting down a traitor. The sun was beating down on his velvet cap, the heat was suffocating, and the stress of ruling a fractured kingdom was boiling inside his skull. Suddenly, a page boy dropped a lance. The loud clatter of steel on steel snapped something deep inside the king's mind. Charles drew his sword, his eyes wide with a terror that no one else could see. He screamed, "Forward against the traitors! They wished to deliver me to the enemy," and charged at his own bodyguards. For an hour, the King of France hacked and slashed at his loyal servants, killing 4 men before his sword finally broke and he fell into a coma. When he woke up, the king was gone. In his place was a trembling, broken shell. This was the beginning of the glass delusion. In his darkest moments, Charles believed he was made entirely of glass. He was terrified that if he sat down too hard, his buttocks would shatter like a dropped vase. He refused to let anyone touch him. He had iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent him from breaking. He refused to bathe for months, covered in his own filth, a living, breathing biohazard sitting on the most powerful throne in Europe. Nature abhors a vacuum, and power abhors a weak king. With Charles howling at the moon, the wolves entered. The palace? On one side was the king's brother, Louis of Orleans. On the other was his cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, known as John the Fearless. They didn't just disagree on tax policy, they hated each other with a biblical intensity. In 147, the Cold War turned hot. John the Fearless hired a gang of thugs to ambush Louis of Orleans on the streets of Paris. They beat him to death, chopped off his hand and scattered his brains on the cobblestones. John didn't even deny it. He hired a theologian to give a sermon arguing that killing Louis was actually a public service. This was the spark for the civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. While the English sharpened their swords across the Channel, the French were busy slitting each other's throats. Enter Henry V of England. If you were casting a villain for a French history movie, Henry is perfect. Young, scarred, fanatically, religious, and utterly ruthless. He looked at the chaos in France, a mad king, a divided nobility, a civil war, and saw an open door. In 1415, Henry landed in France. He marched towards Calais, but the French army cut him off near a castle called Agincourt. The setup was painfully familiar. The French army was massive. The flower of nobility outnumbering the English 5-1. The English were sick with dysentery, tired and wet. But the French had learned absolutely nothing from Casey or Poyer. In fact, they had unlearned things. Chose a battlefield that was a narrow strip of freshly plowed land hemmed in by thick woods. And then it rained. For days, the field turned into a knee-deep swamp of sticky clay. On the morning of October 25th, the French knights, weighed down by 60 pounds of fashionable plate armor, charged, but they didn't gallop. They slogged, they sank. The narrow field acted like a funnel. Thousands of men were squeezed together so tightly, they couldn't even lift their arms to swing a sword. Then the English arrows began to fall. But the real horror wasn't the archery, it was the crush. As the first line of French knights fell into the mud, the second line tripped over them, and the third line pushed them down. Men didn't die from wounds. They drowned in the mud. They were crushed to death by the weight of their own friends. It was a wall of screaming metal. When the arrows ran out, the English archers dropped their bows, picked up hammers, axes, and daggers, and ran into the mud. These light-footed peasants moved like spiders over the piles of trapped beetles. They hammered spikes into the helmets of dukes. They slid knives through the visors of counts. It wasn't a battle. It was an industrial slaughter. 6,000 Frenchmen died that day. The Constable of France, the Admiral, huge chunks of the royal family gone. Henry V lost a few hundred men, but the humiliation didn't end on the battlefield. The final dagger in the heart of the Valois came 5 years later with the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Queen Isabe, the wife of the Mad King, did the unthinkable. She declared that her own son, the Dauphin Charles, was a bastard, a product of her own. Adultery, and therefore had no right to the throne. She signed a treaty that married her daughter, Catherine of Valois, to Henry V. The deal was simple. When Mad King Charles died, Henry V of England would become the King of France. The House of Valois was effectively cancelled. France was no longer a kingdom, it was an inheritance gift for an English warlord. As the ink dried on the treaty, the Mad King sat in his palace playing with his cards, unaware that he had just signed away his country. The sun had set on France, or so it seemed. In the year 1422, the universe threw a curveball that no one expected. Henry V, the terrifying warrior king of England, who was destined to rule France, died of dysentery. He literally shat himself to death at the peak of his power. 2 months later, the Mad King Charles VI finally shattered for the last time and died. Suddenly, the throne of France was a jump ball between two contenders. In the blue corner, sitting in London, was Henry V, an infant who was barely old enough to hold a rattle, let alone a scepter. In the red corner, hiding in the central French city of Bourges, was the Dauphin Charles, and if you looked at him, you would bet your life savings on the baby. History often paints kings as lions, eagles, or wolves. Charles III was more like a frightened rabbit trapped in a briar patch. He was 19 years old, skinny, no-kneed, and possessed a face that seemed permanently etched with anxiety. His enemies mocked him with the title the King of Bourges, implying that his kingdom was no bigger than his backyard, and they weren't far off. This was a man who didn't hold court. He held pity parties. He was so poor that the royal shoemaker refused to give him new boots until he paid his tab. His tunics were frayed at the cuffs. He moved from castle to castle along the Lire Valley, not to survey his domain, but to run away from the English armies that were slowly eating his country alive. But before we judge Charles too harshly, we must look at the horror movie that was his childhood. This boy had grown up in a palace that was essentially an asylum run by murderers. He had watched his insane father attack his own friends. He had been dragged out of his bed in the middle of the night to escape the Bindian death squads that were slaughtering his servants in the hallways. He had seen the streets of Paris paved with bodies. But the deepest knife in his psyche was twisted by his own mother, Queen Isabel. Remember, she was the one who signed the Treaty of Troyes, publicly declaring that Charles was a bastard. Imagine the psychological damage. Your own mother tells the world that you are the product of a sinful affair, that royal blood does not flow in your veins and therefore you are nothing. This accusation paralyzed Charles. It wasn't just political, it was existential. He spent his days in a depressive stupor, paralyzed by doubt. Was he really the king? Or was he just a fraud in a stolen crown? If God wanted him to be king, why? Was he losing? Why was it always raining? Why did everyone he trusted end up dead? He surrounded himself with astrologers and necromancers, desperate for a sign, any sign, that he wasn't doomed. He was a paralyzed Hamlet, a man who would rather hide in his bedroom with the curtains drawn than face the reality of the English longbows. He considered fleeing to Scotland or Spain, abandoning France entirely to become a permanent exile. In 1428, the English laid siege to Orleans, the strategic key to the south. If Orleans fell, the King of Boers would have nowhere left to run. Charles sat in his castle at Chinon, staring at the fire, resigned to his fate. He was a man drowning in the middle of the ocean, waiting for the water to fill his lungs. He didn't know it yet, but the lifeguard was coming, and she wasn't a soldier, a duke, or a bishop. She was a teenage girl who heard voices in her head. If you walked into the Pentagon today and told the Joint Chiefs of Staff that God had personally texted you the nuclear launch codes, you would be tackled by security and sedated. In 1429, the French court was essentially the Pentagon of the Middle Ages, a room full of serious, cynical men who thought they knew how the world worked, and then walked in Joan of Arc. Joan is the glitch in the matrix of history. She was a peasant, girl from Domremy, a muddy village in the middle of nowhere. She couldn't read. She couldn't write. She had never sat on a horse. Yet she claimed that St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret were holding conference calls in her head, telling her to kick the English out of France and crown the Duffer. By all logic, she should have been laughed out of the room or burned as a heretic immediately. But remember, Charles II was desperate. When you are drowning, you don't ask for the lifeguard's swimming license. You just grab the hand. The meeting at the castle of Chanel is one of the most cinematic moments in history. Charles, paralyzed by his own insecurity, decided to test this messenger of God. He stripped off his royal robes and hid himself in the crowd of courtiers. He put a random noble on the throne to act as a decoy. It was a prank born of paranoia. If she was truly sent by God, she would have a divine GPS. If she was a fraud, she would bow to the fake king. Joan walked into the great hall. It was lit by torches and filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and skepticism. She ignored the man on the throne. She walked straight to Charles, who was cowering behind a group of friends in the back. She knelt and said, "Gentle Duffa, I am Jean the maid, and the King of Heaven commands that through me you be anointed and crowned." The room went silent. Charles took her aside for a private conversation. No one knows exactly what they said, but historians suspect Joan revealed a secret that only Charles and God knew, perhaps reassuring him about his legitimacy, telling him that he wasn't a bastard. Whatever she said, Charles walked back into the room with a look on his face that hadn't been there before. Hope. They gave her a suit of white armor, a sword found behind an altar, and a banner. They didn't give her command of the army because they trusted her military genius. They gave her command because the army was depressed. The French soldiers had been losing for so long that they believed God hated them. Joan was their antidepressant. She was a walking, talking miracle. She banned swearing, while she chased away the prostitutes that followed the camp. She forced the rough mercenaries to go to confession. Then came the siege of Orleans. The English had the city in a chokehold. The French generals wanted to be cautious. Joan wanted to charge. She didn't understand flanking maneuvers or logistics. Her strategy was simple. Go there and kill the English because God said so. And it worked. She led the charge herself. When an arrow pierced her shoulder, a wound that would have sent a normal man to the field hospital, she pulled it out, wept for a moment, and then went back to the walls, screaming for the assault. The English were terrified. They were used to fighting knights. They didn't know how to fight a holy maniac who refused to die. They thought she was a witch. The French soldiers, seeing a teenage girl taking an arrow and keeping her feet, decided they were invincible. Orleans was liberated in days. The Lear campaign that followed was a blitzkrieg. Town after town fell. The English longbowmen, who had slaughtered the French for decades, began to panic at the mere sight of her white banner. But the ultimate goal wasn't just winning battles. It was the coronation. In the medieval mind, you weren't really king until you had the holy oil on your forehead. The problem was that Rheims, the city where kings were crowned, was deep in enemy territory. The generals told Charles it was suicide to march there. Joan told him it was destiny. They marched. Cities opened their gates without a fight. 17th 1429. The Dauphin walked into the Cathedral of Reims. The stained glass glowed, the organ played, and there, standing next to the altar, holding her banner, while the heavy crown was placed on Charles's head, was the peasant girl. In less than 6 months, she had done what the House of Valois failed to do for 90 years. She turned a frightened fugitive into King Charles III. But as the holy oil dripped down Charles's face, a cold reality was setting in. The king had what he wanted. The girl had served her purpose. In the Game of Thrones, a weapon that has done its job is often discarded before it becomes dangerous. Politics is a cruel lover. One moment you are the savior of the nation, walking hand in hand with the king. The next you are an inconvenience that needs to be deleted. For Joan of Arc, the fall from grace was faster than a guillotine blade. After the coronation in Reims, the dynamic shifted instantly. Charles II had his crown. He had the holy oil on his forehead. He was legitimate. And like a man who has just won the lottery, he suddenly became very risk-averse. He didn't want to fight anymore. He wanted to negotiate. He wanted to sit in his comfortable castles, drink wine with the Duke of Burgundy, and sign treaties. Joan was not built for treaties. She was a weapon of mass destruction designed by God for one purpose: total war. She kept screaming, "On to Paris! We must take Paris!" She was the loud, embarrassing friend at a dinner party who keeps trying to start a fight while the host is trying to propose a toast. To the royal council, specifically to the fat and corrupt advisor Gord Demo, Jo was no longer a saint. She was a dangerous fanatic, a loose cannon. And in politics, loose cannons tend to point backwards at their owners. The tragedy unfolded at the gates of Compiègne in May 1st, 430. Joan was leading a skirmish against the Bandians. It was a trap, or perhaps just bad luck. But as she retreated toward the safety of the city walls, the governor of Compiègne, a man ostensibly on her side, ordered the drawbridge raised. He locked her out. Joan was left alone on the wrong side of the moat, surrounded by enemies. She was pulled off her horse by her red cloak. The Maid of Orleans was now a prisoner of war. Now this is where the story turns from a war movie into a crime thriller. In the Middle Ages, capturing a VIP was all about the ransom. The Bandians put a price tag on her head. 10,000 levers tuna was a large sum, but for the King of France it was pocket change. Charles II could have paid it. He could have threatened to execute every Bandian prisoner he held. He could have launched a rescue mission. He did absolutely nothing. For months, while Joan sat in a dungeon, Charles III went about his business. He didn't send a letter. He didn't send a coin. His silence was deafening. Why? Because Charles had done the math. A living Joan was a threat. She claimed to hear the voice of God. What if tomorrow God told her that Charles was a bad king? What if she turned the people against him? Dead martyr is a symbol you can put on a flag. A living prophet is a political rival you have to deal with every day. Charles decided to let the English solve his problem for him. English bought her. They needed her dead. But they couldn't just execute her as a soldier. If they did, she would be a martyr for the French cause. No, they had to destroy her reputation. They had to prove she was a witch, because if a witch crowned Charles III, then Charles was a king of hell, not a king of heaven.
Ow.
The Trial at Rouen was a masterpiece of legal theater directed by Bishop Pierre Cochot, a French collaborator on the English payroll. It was a show trial in the truest sense. Joan, an illiterate teenage girl, was pitted against dozens of the most learned theologians. And lawyers in Europe? They threw everything at her. They accused her of heresy, of witchcraft, of talking to demons. They tried to trap her with impossible theological questions. They asked her, "Do you know yourself to be in the grace of God?" It was a verbal landmine. If she said yes, she was a heretic because the church said no. Human can know that for sure. If she said no, she was admitting she was a sinner and a fraud. Joan's answer remains one of the greatest comebacks in history. If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. The judges were stunned. They couldn't break her mind, so they broke her body. They kept her in a secular prison guarded by rough English soldiers who mocked and threatened. Her, finally, they got her on a technicality. Clothes. The Bible says women shouldn't wear men's clothing. Joan refused to wear a dress because in a prison full of predatory male guards, pants were her only protection against rape. The court declared her a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death. On May 30th, 1431, they led her to the Old Market Square in Rouen. They didn't just build a P, they built a stage. They made the platform unusually high so that the executioner could not perform. The customary mercy of strangling the victim before the flames reached them. The English wanted her to feel every second of it. Yes. The fire roared. Joan didn't scream curses. She screamed the name of Jesus. She asked for a cross, and an English soldier moved by pity tied 2 sticks together and gave them to her. When the flames finally consumed her, the English secretaries were crying. One of them famously said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Charles II was safe. The girl who gave him his kingdom was now just a pile of ash thrown into the Seine River to prevent anyone from collecting relics. He had his crown. He had his legitimacy. And best of all, he no longer had to listen to the girl who told him what to do. It was the ultimate act of Machiavellian coldness. Joan died so Charles could rule without a shadow. History has a strange way of distributing credit. Joan of Arc gets the statues, the movies, and the sainthood. Charles III gets a footnote. Yet if Joan was the spark that started the fire, Charles was the cold, unfailing engineer who built the engine that drove the English into the sea. After Joan's ashes floated down the Seine, Charles II underwent a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. The trembling boy in pajamas vanished. In his place stood a man who was patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He realized that miracles are great for morale, but they are terrible for logistics. You cannot run a kingdom on visions. You run it on taxes and professional soldiers. Charles's greatest achievement wasn't a battle. It was a bureaucracy. For centuries, French armies were a disorganized mess of feudal levies and mercenaries, essentially armed gangs who pillaged French villages whenever the king forgot to pay them. Charles looked at this chaos and decided to nationalize violence. In 1445, he issued the Ordinance of Orleans, creating the Compane. This was the first standing army in Europe since the Roman Empire. No more unruly knights fighting for glory. These were professional killers paid a regular salary by the state, wearing state uniforms and obeying state orders. To pay for this, Charles made the taille, a direct tax on land, permanent. He didn't ask the Estates General for permission. He just took it. He essentially told the French people, "You can either pay me to protect you, or you can be raped and robbed by the English. Your choice." It was a protection racket, but it worked. With this new machine, Charles went to work. He didn't rush. He waited. He signed the Treaty of Arras with the Duke of Burgundy, finally ending the civil war that had bled France dry. Bribed, he negotiated, and he waited for the English to run out of money. And then the guns spoke. Under the direction of the Bureau brothers, two geniuses of artillery, France developed the best cannons in the world. The end of the 100 Years' War didn't look like a court. It looked like the Battle of Castile in 1453. The English commander, John Talbot, a relic of the old age, charged his men toward the French lines expecting a sword fight. Instead, he was met by a wall of cannon fire. The French artillery shredded the English army. It was the moment gunpowder officially retired the medieval knight. Talbot died, and with him the English dream of ruling France. After 116 years of war, the English were kicked out. They lost everything except for the tiny port of Killala. Charles III, the man who started as a joke, had reunited the country. He was given the title Charles the Victorious. But here is the dark punchline of his reign. In 1456, 25 years after he let Joan burn, Charles ordered a retrial. He cleared her name. He declared her innocent. Was this because he felt guilty? Or was he haunted by the ghost of the girl who saved him? Absolutely not. Charles cleared Joan's name because a king cannot be crowned by a heretic. If Joan was a witch, his crown was dirty. If she was a saint, his crown was holy. Even her rehabilitation was a political calculation. He didn't do it for her. He did it for his own PR. Charles III died in 1461. His end was fittingly tragic. He didn't die in battle. He starved himself to death. Why? Because he was terrified that his own son, the future Louis XI, was poisoning his food. The man who united France died alone, paranoid and hungry, trusting no one. His legacy teaches us a brutal lesson about power. A great king is rarely a good man. Charles II was ungrateful, cold, and selfish, but he was exactly what France needed. He saved the nation, but he sold his soul to do it. If history were a high school popularity contest, Louis XI would be the weird kid in the back of the class who eats glue, talks to himself, and secretly knows the passwords to everyone's email accounts. He is without a doubt the most fascinating, repulsive, and brilliant monarch to ever sit on the French throne. They called him the Universal Spider, not because he had superpowers, but because he sat in the center of a vast web of spies, plots, and bribes, waiting for his enemies to fly into it. But before he was the Spider King, he was the Spider Prince, and he hated his father, Charles III, with a passion that would make Freud blush. The relationship between Charles II and Louis was toxic radioactive waste. Charles saw his son as a threat, a cunning, impatient predator, waiting for the old lion to die. Louis saw his father as a senile, ungrateful fool who was surrounded by incompetent mistresses and corrupt advisors. Louis didn't just rebel against his father once. He did it constantly. He was the patron saint of ungrateful children. In 1446, things got so bad that Louis was essentially banished from the court. But Louis didn't go quietly to his room. He fled to the one place on earth his father hated most, Burgundy. He threw himself at the mercy of Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. It was a master stroke of irony. Philip welcomed the doer, gave him money, and let him set up a court in exile. Philip thought he was being smart, grooming the future king of France to be a Burgundian puppet. He famously said, "I am nurturing the fox that will eat my chickens." He had no idea how right he was. The fox wasn't just going to eat the chickens. He was going to burn down the entire farm. For 5 long years, Louis sat in Burgundy watching, learning, and waiting. He didn't fight, he waited. He built a network of informants. He memorized the names of every noble, every bishop, and every banker in Europe. And he waited for his father to die. When the news finally came in, 1461, that Charles II had starved himself to death out of fear of being poisoned, a fear Louis happily encouraged, Louis didn't shed a tear. He simply packed his bags and rode to Rennes to claim his prize. But when the people of France got their first look at their new king, they were confused, expected a monarch in golden armor, velvet robes, and jewels. What they got was Louis XI. Louis looked like a vagrant who had just been kicked out of a tavern. He was physically ugly, with a long nose, spindly legs, and a hunched posture. He dressed in cheap, rough fustian cloth that even a merchant would find embarrassing. He wore an old, greasy felt hat, and around the brim of this hat, he pinned cheap lead medallions of various saints. This wasn't because he was poor. He was the richest man in the kingdom. It was a power move, Louis realized. That looking like a king was a waste of money. Being a king was about power. He despised the pomp and circumstance of chivalry, while his enemies, like the Dukes of Burgundy, bankrupted themselves buying gold cloth and throwing tournaments. Louis saved his money to buy something more useful: men. His court was a freak show. He fired all the high-born nobles his father had employed and replaced them with low-born professionals. His closest advisor was his barber, Olivier Lair. His executioner, Tristan Lamet, was his drinking buddy. Louis preferred the company of hangmen, doctors, and astrologers to that of dukes and counts. He knew that a low-born man he raised up would be loyal forever, whereas a duke would always try to stab him in the back. But don't let the dirty hat fool you. Underneath that shabby exterior was a mind like a steel trap. Louis was deeply superstitious. Yes, he would constantly take his hat off to talk to the lead statues, bribing the saints with promises of churches if they helped him kill his enemies. It was transactional religion, dear Virgin Mary. Let me destroy the Duke of Brittany, when I will buy you a nice altar. He was a workaholic. He traveled constantly, not in a royal carriage, but on a mule, moving from town to town, checking the accounts, inspecting the walls, and terrifying the local mayors. He knew the price of wheat in Paris and the price of wool in Flanders. Knew who was sleeping with whom, who was in debt, and who could be bought. Louis XI had arrived. The age of the knight was over. The age of the bureaucrat, the spy, and the briber had begun. And the rest of Europe was about to find out that a king who dresses like a beggar is far more dangerous than a king who dresses like a god. In the year 1465, the French nobility finally woke up. They realized that the strange, shabby man sitting on the throne wasn't just eccentric, he was dangerous. Louis XI was systematically dismantling their feudal rights, was taxing their lands, ignoring their advice, and treating dukes like employees. So they did what rich, powerful men always do when their privileges are threatened. They formed a union. They called it the League of the Public Weal. It was a masterpiece of political branding. The name suggested they were fighting for the good of the common people, for the welfare of the nation. In reality, it was a coalition of greedy princes who wanted their tax breaks back. It was a league of private greed, masquerading as a charity. The lineup of this rebellion was a who's who of people who hated Louis. It included the Duke of Brittany, the Duke of Bourbon, and the most dangerous of all, Charles the Bold of Burgundy. But the knife that twisted deepest was the leader of the League, Charles of France, Louis's own younger brother. It was a family reunion, Valois style, which meant everyone brought armies instead of casseroles. They marched on Paris. They surrounded the capital, expecting Louis to panic. They had more men, better knights, and shinier armor. They expected a great battle, a glorious clash of steel, where they could crush the Spider King under the hooves. Of their war horses, Louis gave them the Battle of Mollary. It was a chaotic, bloody mess, where both sides claimed victory, but thousands died for nothing. Louis looked at the pile of corpses and came to a conclusion that would define his reign. War is stupid. War is a coin toss. And Louis XI did not like gambling unless the dice were loaded. Why risk losing your crown to a lucky arrow shot when you can defeat your enemy with a bag of gold and a piece of paper? So Louis did the unthinkable. He surrendered. Or at least that's what it looked like. Invited the rebel princes to a negotiation table. He smiled. He bowed. And he gave them everything they asked for. You want the Duchy of Normandy? Take it, little brother. You want the Somme towns back? They are yours, Charles of Burgundy. You want a pension? Here is a chest of gold. The nobles were ecstatic. They thought Louis was weak. They thought he was a coward who had folded under pressure. They signed the Treaty of Conful, packed up their armies, and went home laughing at the foolish king who had given away half his kingdom. But they didn't see the invisible strings attached to every gift. Louis wasn't giving away land. He was planting time bombs. He gave Normandy to his brother, knowing that the Duke of Brittany wanted Normandy too. He gave towns to Burgundy. That would cause friction with the Holy Roman Empire. He threw huge chunks of meat to the wolves, knowing that once their bellies were full, they would start fighting each other over the scraps. And while the nobles were busy counting their gold, Louis went to work. He used the peace he had bought. To pick them off one by one, he bribed the captains of their armies to desert. He stirred up revolts in their cities. Within months, the League of the Public Weal disintegrated. Louis marched into Normandy and took it back from his brother without a fight. He took back the towns. He kept the receipts. He had rented peace for a few months, and the return on investment was total control. But how did he know exactly who to bribe and when to strike? This brings us to Louis's greatest invention, the royal post. Before Louis, if you wanted to send a message, you gave it to a guy on a horse and hoped he didn't get eaten by wolves or get drunk at a tavern. Gosh. Louis established the first system of relay stations across France. Fresh horses were kept ready at specific intervals along all major roads. This meant a message could travel from Paris to the borders in 24 hours, while his enemies' messages took a week. But the royal post wasn't just for delivering mail. It was the internet of the 15th century, and Louis was the only one with the login password. He read everyone's mail. He knew what the Duke of Brittany was eating for dinner. He knew who the Duke of Bourbon was sleeping with. Louis XI turned the entire kingdom into a panopticon. He employed a legion of spies that would make the KGB jealous. All these weren't just guys in cloaks hiding in shadows. They were monks, prostitutes, barbers, and merchants. If you whispered a joke about the king's big nose in a tavern in Lyon, Louis knew about it in Paris by Tuesday. He kept a little book where he wrote down the names of everyone who could be useful and everyone who had a price. He knew that every man has a weakness. For some it was gold, for others it was a title, for some it was a woman. Louis provided them all. There is a famous story that summarizes his approach. When he discovered his own cardinal, Jean Valois, was plotting against him, Louis didn't just execute him. That would be too simple. He imprisoned Valois in a small iron cage where he could neither stand up nor lie down. Kept him there for 11 years. Louis would occasionally visit him just to chat. It was a terrifying reminder to the rest of the court. Spider sees everything. And if you get caught in the web, death is the easy way out. Every great villain needs a hero, and every great schemer needs a victim. For Louis X, 11th, that victim was Charles, the Duke of Burgundy. History calls him Charles the Bold. Louis probably called him Charles, the useful idiot. Was everything Louis was not. He was handsome, athletic, and obsessed with the romance of chivalry. He dressed in gold cloth, rode magnificent war horses, and believed that problems were best solved by charging at them and hitting them very hard. He was the wealthiest man in Europe, ruling over a stretch of land that included modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. His ambition was simple. He wanted to turn Burgundy into a kingdom equal to France. He was a bull, powerful, aggressive, and not particularly bright. Louis was the spider, small, patient, and venomous. But even spiders can make mistakes. And in 1468, Louis made a blunder that almost cost him his head. He decided to visit Charles personally at the town of Perrin to negotiate a treaty. Louis thought he could charm the Duke, wrap him in words, and leave with a deal. He was so confident in his own intelligence that he walked into the lion's den. With only a small escort, it was a fatal miscalculation. Just as they sat down to talk, news arrived that the citizens of Lise, a town under Burgundian control, had revolted. They were burning buildings and killing the Duke's soldiers. They were waving French flags. Why? Because Louis's secret agents had paid them to do it? Charles the Bold went nuclear. He realized Louis had come to his house to talk peace, while simultaneously stabbing him in the back. He locked the gates of the castle. Louis XI, the king of France, was now a prisoner. For 3 days, Charles paced around his room, screaming that he would kill the king. Louis, trapped in a tower, could hear the Duke shouting. He knew he was inches away from execution. This was the only time in his life that Louis was truly terrified. But fear focuses the mind. Louis did what he did best. He opened his wallet. He bribed the Duke's advisors to calm him down. Then he did the most humiliating thing imaginable. He agreed to sign a treaty giving Charles everything he wanted. But the cherry on top of this humiliation sundae was that Charles forced Louis to ride with him to Liege and watch as the Burgundian army slaughtered the very rebels Louis had incited. The King of France had to cheer while his own allies were butchered. Louis returned to Paris alive, but deeply shamed. He ordered that all the magpies and talking birds in Paris be killed because people had taught them to squawk the word pan. To mock him, but he had learned a valuable lesson. Never put yourself in a room with a bull. From now on, he would stay in his web. The revenge of the spider was slow, silent, and absolute. Louis knew he couldn't beat Charles on the battlefield. The Burgundian army was too strong. So Louis decided to outsource the violence. He looked at the map and found the one group of people in Europe who loved fighting even more than Charles: the Swiss. The Swiss canton were a collection of mountain peasants who fought with 18-t-long pikes. They were poor. They were angry. They were the most terrifying infantry in the world. Louis simply opened a line of credit. He poured gold into Switzerland. He didn't ask them to fight for France. He paid them to defend their own borders against Burgundian aggression. At the same time, he funded René, the Duke of Lorraine, whose land Charles was trying to conquer. Louis sat back in his castle at Pyleures and watched the tragedy unfold. It was a proxy war, perfectly executed. Charles the Bold, blinded by his own ego, took the bait. He attacked the Swiss at the Battle of Grandson and the Battle of Merton in 1476. The Swiss pike squares ground the Burgundian knights into hamburger meat. Charles lost his artillery, his treasure, and his reputation. But Charles couldn't stop. He was a gambler, chasing his losses. In the freezing winter of 1477, he marched on Nancy to fight René of Lorraine. His army was starving, frozen, and unpaid. Louis XI had one final card to play. He bribed Charles's Italian commander, the Count of Campobasso, to defect. On the morning of the battle, Campobasso and his men simply rode away, leaving Charles. Exposed, the battle was a massacre. The Swiss and the LunaLore swarmed the Burgundian lines. Charles the Bold, the Grand Duke of the West, fought until his horse was killed under him. Days later, they found his body in a frozen, muddy ditch. It was a sight that marked the end of the Middle Ages. The glorious Duke was naked, stripped by letters. His face had been cloven in half by a halberd, and his cheek had been gnawed away by wolves. He was so disfigured that his own physician could only identify him by his ingrown toenails and old battle scars. When the news reached Louis XI, he was sitting at dinner. He didn't cheer. He didn't laugh. He simply nodded, finished his wine, and ordered his armies to march. Not to fight, but to occupy. With Charles dead and leaving only a daughter, Mary of Burgundy, there was no one left to stop France. Louis swallowed the Duce of Burgundy. Whole, the great rival was gone, eaten by wolves and bad decisions. The spider had won without drawing his sword. There is a terrible price to be paid for being the smartest person in the room. Eventually you realize that everyone else is just a potential traitor waiting for you to blink. Louis XI spent his life weaving a web to catch his enemies. But in his final years, he became the fly trapped in his own nightmare. The end of Louis the Spider was not a glorious sunset. It was a horror movie set in a fortress called Pile. This wasn't a palace designed for balls or banquets. It was a bunker. The walls were thick. The windows were barred with iron, and the grounds were patrolled by Scottish archers with orders to shoot anyone who approached after dark without a password. Louis, the man who had expanded France from the Atlantic to the Alps, withdrew into this self-made prison. He was terrified of assassination, saw daggers in every shadow and poison in every cup. He changed his bedroom servants constantly, fearing they had been bribed. He refused to see his own son, the future Charles VII, because he believed that boy was waiting for him to die. He was right, of course, but that didn't make the isolation any less crushing. His physical health was failing. He had suffered several strokes that left him weak and partially paralyzed, but his mind remained as sharp and terrified as ever. He tried to bargain with the one enemy he couldn't bribe, death. He filled his room with relics. He sent ships to the Cape Verde Islands to find turtle blood, which quacks told him was a cure for leprosy and old age. He spent a fortune collecting the bones of saints, piling them around his bed like a spiritual barricade. He was bullied by his own doctor, a man named Jacques Quartier. Now Quartier knew the king was terrified of dying, so he extorted him. He would say, "Sire, you look terrible today. I can save you, but it will cost you another 10,000 crowns." And Louis, the man who had outsmarted the Duke of Burgundy and the King of England, would pay. He paid because for all his power, he was just a frightened old man who didn't want to go to hell. And yet, if we step back from the paranoia and the iron cages, those infamous king's little girls in which he locked his prisoners, we must admit a grudging respect for what this monster achieved. Louis XI is the true architect of modern France. Before him, France was a loose collection of feudal territories held together by duct tape and prayers. After him, France was a nation. He destroyed the power of the great feudal lords. He broke the independent duchies of Burgundy, Brittany, Armagnac, and Anjou, absorbing them into the royal domain. He created a centralized state where power flowed from one source, the king. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was an economist. Encouraged the silk industry in Lyon, which is still famous today. He established fairs to compete with foreign markets, standardized weights and measures, created a postal system that shrank the world. He was the first king to realize that a rich country pays more taxes than a poor one. When he finally died on August 30th, 1483, the kingdom didn't mourn. They exhaled. The bells rang, not in sadness, but in relief. The spider was dead, but he left behind a machine, a powerful, centralized, absolute monarchy that would run for another 300 years. He handed his son a loaded gun. Unfortunately, as we were about to see, the Valois family had a talent for shooting themselves in the foot. Louis XI was the first modern king. He taught the world that a ruler doesn't need to be loved. He just needs to be effective. He was ugly. He was cruel. And he was paranoid. but he was also the man who turned the map of France from a jigsaw puzzle into a masterpiece. If Louis XI was the strict father who saved every penny and drove an old car to build the family fortune, his successors were the spoiled children who bought a Ferrari and crashed it into a wall on the first day. The moment the Spider King died, the House of Valois decided that saving money was boring. They looked south across the Alps, towards the shimmering, sun-drenched city-states of Italy. They didn't see a political quagmire. They saw a playground. It started with Charles VII, a man whose intelligence was inversely proportional to his enthusiasm. He invaded Italy in 1494, marching with an army that looked more like a parade. He conquered Naples with chalk, meaning his quartermasters simply marked the doors of the houses where his soldiers would sleep, but Charles is best remembered for his exit from history. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die of plague. He died because he walked into a doorframe. Yes, the King of France struck his head on a lintel while going to watch a tennis match and died of a coma. It was a slapstick end to a foolish reign. His cousin Louis XII took over and continued the obsession. He was a decent man known as the father of the people domestically, but in foreign policy he was an addict hooked on the drug of Italian conquest. But these two were just the opening acts. The main event arrived in 1515. Enter Francis I. If you asked a casting director to build the perfect king, they would build Francis. He was 6 feet tall, a giant for his time. He was handsome, athletic, charming, and possessed an ego large enough to have its own gravitational pull. His symbol was the salamander, the mythical lizard that lives in fire. And Francis loved the fire. Francis didn't just want to rule France, he wanted to style it. He looked at the grim medieval castles of his ancestors and sneered. He wanted light. He wanted marble. He wanted art. He is the reason the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre today. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, giving the old master a manor house and treating him like a father. Legend says Leonardo died in the king's arms. Whether that is true or not, it fits the brand Francis was selling, the patron king, the enlightened monarch. He turned the Lire Valley into a construction site of unimaginable luxury. Look at the Château de Saumur. It isn't a house. It is a fever dream of stone. It has 440 rooms, 84 staircases, and a roofline that looks like a crowded city skyline. The central staircase is a double helix designed by Da Vinci himself, so that a person going up never meets a person coming down. It's perfect for a king who wants to avoid his wife while meeting his mistress. But this golden age had a dark underbelly. Francis was obsessed with rivalry. He was trapped in a 3-way geopolitical wrestling match with Henry VIII of England and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. These 3 men spent their lives trying to outdo each other in war, clothes, and parties. The most ridiculous example was the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. Francis and Henry met for a summit near Killala. They built temporary palaces made of gold fabric. They had fountains running with red wine. They wrestled each other in the mud. It was the most expensive frat party in history, designed to show who was the alpha male. But while Francis was partying, Charles V was plotting. Charles V was the emperor of half the known world, ruling Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, and the New World. France was encircled. Francis, in his infinite wisdom, decided the best way to break this circle was to invade Italy again. He wanted the Duchy of Milan. He wanted it so badly it blinded him. In 1525, the bill for all this vanity finally came due at the Battle of Pavia. Francis led his army personally. He had the best heavy cavalry in Europe and, crucially, superior artillery. As the battle began, the French cannons were tearing the Spanish imperial troops to pieces. Victory was minutes away. All Francis had to do was sit still and let his guns finish the job. But Francis was a knight. He was the salamander. He couldn't just sit and watch. He wanted the glory. So he ordered his cavalry to charge. He rode right in front of his own cannons, forcing his gunners to stop firing so they wouldn't hit their own king. It was a tactical blunder of catastrophic proportions. Without the artillery fire, the imperial troops regrouped. Spanish arquebusiers, Men with primitive guns emerged from the trees. They shot the horses out from under the French knights. The heavy cavalry, trapped in the mud and weighed down by armor, were slaughtered like turtles flipped on their backs. Francis fought like a demon, but he was surrounded. His horse was killed. He was pulled to the ground, battered and bruised. The King of France, the Golden Monarch, was captured. He was shipped off to a prison in Madrid, a trophy for his rival, Charles V, from his cell. He wrote a letter to his mother, Louise of Savoy. It contained one of the most famous and delusional lines in history. "Madame, all is lost, save honor." It sounded poetic. It sounded noble, but it was a lie. Honor doesn't pay ransoms. Honor doesn't bring back the thousands of French soldiers who died because their king wanted to play hero. To get Francis back, France had to pay a ransom that nearly bankrupted the nation and sign a humiliating treaty, giving up claims to Italy. Francis even had to send his 2 young sons to be hostages in Spain in his place. He traded his children for his freedom, so much for honor. The Renaissance had arrived in France. Wearing a golden mask to hide a face scarred by hubris and bad parenting. The year is 1559. King Henry II is 40 years old. He is strong, he is stubborn, and he is about to become the poster child for why middle-aged men should not engage in extreme sports. To celebrate a peace treaty and a double wedding, Henry decided to participate in a jousting tournament. He wasn't doing it for policy. He was doing it to show off before his mistress, Diane Dyer. His opponent was the young Count of Montgomery. They charged. The lances shattered. It should have been over. But Henry, fueled by adrenaline and stupidity, demanded a rematch. He wanted to break one more lance. Montgomery tried to refuse, sensing that punching the king in the face with a stick was a bad career move. But the king insisted. They charged again. This time Montgomery's lance shattered against the king's helmet. A long, jagged splinter of wood pierced the king's visor, entered his eye, and drove deep into his brain. For 10 days, Henry II lay in agony, while the best doctors in Europe, including the famous anatomist Vizelaus, tried to remove the wood. They failed. The king died screaming. That splinter didn't just kill a man. It lobotomized the French monarchy. Stepping out from the shadows of the funeral chamber was a woman dressed entirely in black. Her name was Catherine de' Medici. For years she had been the invisible wife, humiliated by her husband's obsession with his mistress. The French court called her the Italian shopkeeper, mocking her merchant banking origins. They said she smelled of Florentine spices and witchcraft. But now the king was dead. The mistress was banished, and the shopkeeper was open for business. Catherine found herself holding a crumbling country. The Protestant Reformation had arrived in France, not with a polite knock, but with a sledgehammer. The country was split into 2 armed camps. On one side, the House of Guise, fanatical Catholics who believed that the only good Protestant was a burning one. On the other, the House of Bourbon, ambitious Protestants who wanted to turn France into a Calvinist state. Catherine didn't care about theology. She cared about power. She viewed religion the way a chef views ingredients, something to be mixed and stirred to create the dish she wanted, survival. She became the regent, the referee in a knife fight between religious gangsters. But her tragedy was that her only weapons were her children. And unfortunately, the Valois gan pool had run dry. Her first son, Francis II, was 15 years old when he became king. He was a sickly, wheezing boy, completely dominated by his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, and her uncles, the Guise brothers. His reign was short and pathetic. He didn't die in battle, died of an ear infection that turned into a brain abscess. He rotted from the inside out after less than 2 years on the throne. Next up was Charles I. He was only 10 years old. If Francis was weak, Charles was unstable. He was a boy who oscillated between clinging to his mother's skirts and flying into violent rages. He had a terrifying look in his eyes, a mixture of fear and cruelty. He loved hunting, but not in the noble sense. He liked the killing part. Catherine managed him by keeping him terrified of the world, making herself the only safe harbor. She was the puppet master, but the puppet she was controlling was holding a loaded gun. And then there was the favorite, Henry, the Duke of Anjou, later Henry III. He was Catherine's masterpiece and her greatest disappointment. Henry was intelligent, eloquent, and a brave soldier, but he was also eccentric. He preferred peace and poetry to war. He surrounded himself with a group of handsome young men called the minions, or the darlings. They dressed in extravagant clothes, wore makeup, and curled their hair. The king himself was often seen playing with a bilbeat, a cup, and ball toy. During council meetings, while his generals discussed massacres, the people of Paris, rough and fanatical, hated him. They called him the king of the island of hermaphrodites. They saw his refinement as weakness and his tolerance as heresy. So there stood Catherine de' Medici, the Black Queen, a widow in a veil, standing between a mad son, an eccentric son, and a nation that wanted to tear itself apart. She tried to balance the factions. She tried to marry her children to rival houses to buy peace. She tried edicts of tolerance. But in a world drunk on religious hatred, moderation is a fatal sin. The pressure was building, steam was hissing, and Catherine, in her desperation to save the Valois name, was about to make a decision that would stain history with blood forever.
If you think Game of Thrones invented the concept of a red wedding, you clearly haven't studied French history. In August 1572, Paris hosted the original nightmare nuptials. It was supposed to be the event of the century, the marriage of the king's sister, Marguerite of Valois, to the leading Protestant prince, Henry of Navarre. On paper, it was a brilliant move by Catherine de' Medici. A Catholic princess marries a Protestant prince, and boom, religious peace is achieved. Love conquers hate. But in reality, it was like hosting a peace conference in a powder magazine and inviting everyone to bring their own matches. Paris was sweltering in a summer heatwave. The city was packed. Thousands of wealthy Huguenots, French Protestants, had flocked to the capital to celebrate their leader's wedding. They walked the streets in their drab black clothes, looking down on the flashy, colorful Catholics. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a dagger, and soon everyone would be doing exactly that. The wedding took place on August 18th. 4 days later, the first domino fell. Admiral Coligny, the military leader of the Protestants and a father figure to King Charles IX, was walking home when a shot rang out from a window. An assassin hired by the guy's family had missed his heart and shattered his arm. Coligny survived, but the peace did not. The Protestants were furious. They demanded justice. They threatened war. Catherine de' Medici panicked. She realized that the investigation would eventually lead back to her or her allies. She saw a Protestant coup coming. She dragged her son, the unstable 22-year-old King Charles IX, into a private meeting. For hours, Catherine and her advisors hammered the young king. They told him the Protestants were coming to kill him. They told him the only way to survive was to strike first. Charles, mentally fragile and terrified, finally snapped. In a fit of hysterical rage, he screamed the words that would doom thousands. "Well, then kill them, but kill them all. Don't leave a single one alive to reproach me." It was the permission slip for a genocide. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 24th, the feast of St. Bartholomew, the bell of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll. It wasn't a call to prayer. It was a signal. The Duke of Guise led his men to Admiral Coligny's house. They dragged the wounded old man out of bed, stabbed him, and threw his body out the window onto the street, where Guise kicked the corpse in the face. That was the opening act. What followed was not a battle. It was a hunting trip. The city gates were locked. Chains were drawn across the river to stop boats from escaping. Royal guards moved from house to house, using lists of names to execute Protestant nobles in their beds. But then the mob joined in. Ordinary Catholic citizens, fueled by years of hate and sermons, turned on their neighbors. Butchers used their cleavers on customers. Landlords killed their tenants. The Seine River turned red, choked with so many bodies that people downstream couldn't drink the water for months. In the Louvre Palace, Henry of Navarre, the groom, was dragged out of bed and given a choice: convert to Catholicism or die. He chose life. He fell to his knees and prayed to the Virgin Mary while his friends were being butchered in the courtyard just outside the door. King Charles IX reportedly stood by a window with a hunting musket, taking pot shots at fleeing Protestants. "Kill them all," he had said. And for 3 days, Paris obliged. Estimates of the dead range from 5,000 to 30,000 across France. But the massacre didn't save the Valois. It broke them. Charles IX never recovered. He was haunted by the faces of his victims. He began to sweat blood, likely a symptom of advanced tuberculosis mixed with extreme stress. He died 2 years later, raving in delirium, begging God for forgiveness. This left the throne to the last brother, Henry III, and this sets the stage for the final absurd act of the Valois tragedy, the War of the Three Henrys. Imagine a Mexican standoff, but everyone is named Henry. First, we have Henry III, the king, the last Valois, intelligent but erratic, cross-dressing and despised by his own people for being too moderate. Second, we have Henry of Guise, the ultra-Catholic, the mastermind of the massacre. Handsome, charismatic, and the idol of the Paris mob. He wanted the crown for himself. Third, we have Henry of Navarre, the Protestant, the survivor of the Red Wedding. He had escaped Paris, renounced Catholicism, and was leading the rebel armies in the south. It was a chaos of shifting alliances. At one point, the king allied with the Protestant Henry against the Catholic Henry. The people of Paris were so furious at their king's betrayal that they rose up in the day of the barricades and chased Henry III out of his own capital. Humiliated and desperate, Henry III realized that as long as the Duke of Guise was alive, he was really not king. So he resorted to the classic Valois solution, murder. In December 1588, the king invited the Duke of Guise to a council meeting at the Château du Blois. Guise was warned not to go. He laughed. He wouldn't dare, he said. He underestimated the desperation of a weak man. As Guise entered the king's chamber, the royal bodyguards, the 45, pounced on him. Guise was a giant of a man. He fought them off, dragging 4 men across the room with him before finally collapsing at the foot of the king's bed. Henry III emerged from behind a curtain. He walked over to the body of his rival, kicked it, just as Guise had kicked Coligny 16 years earlier, and reportedly said, "My God, he looks even bigger dead than he did alive." It was a momentary victory, but by murdering the hero of the Catholics, Henry III signed his own death warrant. The Valois dynasty had killed its way to the top, and now it would die by the knife. After kicking the corpse of the Duke of Guise, King Henry III probably felt a moment of relief. He thought he had cut off the head of the snake. He was wrong. He had only poked a hornet's nest. The Catholic League did not collapse. It exploded with rage. The Pope excommunicated the king.
The people of Paris declared him a tyrant, a heretic, and a murderer. Henry III, the King of France, was now a homeless man with a crown. He had no choice but to flee to the camp of his former enemy, his cousin Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader. It was a humiliating alliance of necessity. Together, the two Henrys marched on Paris, ready to besiege their own capital. But on August 1st, 1589, while Henry III was sitting on his commode at Saint-Cloud, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clément asked for a private audience. The monk claimed he had secret intelligence. The guards let him in. As the king took the letter, the monk pulled a poisoned knife from his sleeve and plunged it into the royal stomach. Henry pulled the knife out and struck the monk, screaming, "The wicked monk! He has killed me!" The guards rushed in and killed the assassin instantly, but the damage was done. The king lingered for a few hours in agony. Before he died, he called Henry of Navarre to his bedside. He knew the truth. He had no sons. The Valois line, which had started with a legal argument against the English, was ending in a pool of blood and feces. He pointed to Henry of Navarre and said, "He is the true king of France." And then Henry III died. The House of Valois was extinct. Henry of Navarre was now Henry IV. But the transition wasn't smooth. He was a Protestant king in a Catholic country. He had to fight for 4 more years to enter Paris. Finally, in 1593, he uttered the most pragmatic sentence in French history: "Paris is well worth a mass." He converted to Catholicism. The gates of Paris opened, and the House of Bourbon officially took the stage. The Valois were gone, leaving behind only ghosts and cautionary tales. Looking back at the 261 years of the House of Valois is like watching a car crash in slow motion. Horrifying, yet you cannot look away. Their legacy is a 3-act tragedy of human nature. Act 1 was the age of naivety. Philip VI and John the Good believed in chivalry. They believed that war was a sport, and that God favored the man with the shinier armor. They were wrong, and the English longbows taught them a bloody lesson in modernization. Act 2 was the age of cunning. Charles V and Louis XI learned the lesson. They threw away the code of chivalry and picked up the code of Machiavelli. They built the French state. They centralized power. They created the army, the tax system, and the borders that we recognize today. They were the architects of France, using mortar made of crushed bones and lies. Act 3 was the age of madness. Renaissance kings Francis I and his descendants took that power and drowned it in vanity and religious fanaticism. They built beautiful castles like Chambord, but they filled the cellars with the corpses of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the end, the House of Valois serves as the ultimate proof that building a nation is messy work. They found France a feudal ruin. They left it a centralized powder keg. They were not good men. Most of them were terrible men. But without their ambition, their paranoia, and their ruthless will to survive, France as we know it would not exist. The philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli once wrote, "Men are so simple and yield so readily to the desires of the moment that he who will deceive will always find another who will suffer to be deceived." The Valois deceived, and they suffered. They played the game of thrones, and in the end, the game played them. But the wheel of history never stops turning. The crown has passed to the House of Bourbon, and if you think the Valois were dramatic, just wait. The Bourbons will bring us the Sun King, Louis XIV, a man whose ego was so large it needed its own zip code. They will bring the ultimate absolute monarchy, and eventually they will bring the guillotine. But that is a story for another day. What do you think? Who was the most fascinating member of this dysfunctional family? Was it the brave but abandoned Joan of Arc, the cunning Spider King Louis XI, or the ruthless Catherine de' Medici? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the blood-soaked history of France, please like this video and subscribe to Dynasty Saga. We are just getting started. I am your narrator, and remember, history is not just dates and maps, it's a warning. See you in the next dynasty.